believe it or not, I spent the first half of my life or so actively avoiding people with disabilities. Yeah, I'm in a wheelchair. I have been since I was 4 years old. And yeah, I have a disability myself, spinal muscular atrophy, which causes my muscles to degenerate over time. But it was okay talking with friends who had disabilities on the phone, or at summer camp we could play pranks together, but that was outside the public eye. When I was at school or when I was out and about town, I tried my very hardest to fit in with the mainstream. I began kindergarten in 1989. That was 1 year prior to the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. And I never really thought of myself as the other growing up, but over time, it became obvious. When it was time for me to choose a college, I went to a small liberal arts school where I was the only person on campus who used a wheelchair. I was one of only 2 people on campus that was vocal about having a disability. And one day while I was on campus, I got an email from a woman in the Career Center who suggested that I apply to study abroad in Washington, D.C. for a semester. It was through an all-expenses-paid scholarship, courtesy of the American Association of People with Disabilities. Meh. Again, it was a group I wasn't really interested in, didn't want to associate with, but then again, money was attached. So needless to say, I applied for and was awarded the scholarship. Fast forward to August of that year, where I was in my apartment unpacking for my internship, and I got a call from my supervisor. The supervisor told me that there was a problem with my background check paperwork, and I need not show up for work the next day, which was supposed to be my first day, nor any other day. Oh no. After some tears, I remembered that I had been offered an internship by the National Council on Disability, or NCD, several months earlier. Now I meekly picked up the phone, called back my interviewer, and asked if the internship was still on the table. Very fortunately, the NCD said yes and re-extended its offer, permitting me to stay in DC for the period of my scholarship. One of my first projects at NCD was reviewing the white papers that the agency had put out in the prior 10 years. After just my first white paper, I was stunned. People with disabilities, just like me, were often living on a $700 a month Social Security check, forced by the end of the month to decide whether they would pay rent or buy groceries. Worse still, others just like me, again, were often imprisoned in nursing homes. It was my time at the NCD that led to my decision to become an attorney. Non-discrimination in employment is the first title of the ADA, but it's often cited as the least successful. We're now nearly 30 years since the act has been passed, and the numbers for workers with disabilities still don't look that great. For example, in 2018, the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the employment participation rate for people with disabilities is less than half of the labor participation rate for people without disabilities. As companies increasingly become interested in corporate diversity initiatives, too often they're leaving people with disabilities behind. I'd like to take a look at just one profession, if you'll grant me that for a moment. Mine. Again, there aren't great numbers on attorneys in the legal field with disabilities because most businesses don't capture or even think about these numbers. Instead, diversity initiatives usually focus on gender, race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, and so forth. But fortunately, one organization, the National Association for Law Placement, which is an organization that aggregates data from 693 law firms across the country, does look at disability. In their 2018 survey, which covers information from about 70,000 attorneys, the association found that just over 0.5% of attorneys self-identified as having disabilities. Yes, that's 0.005%. Think about that for a minute. 0.005%. Well, I certainly felt elite when I graduated with my joint JD MA degree, but it took me 3 years after graduating to get hired. In fact, I had to work for 8 weeks for free to prove to my employer that hiring me would be worth it. Theoretically, there should be lots of opportunities for people with high-level degrees, but they're just not there. When I started working, I was very happy. I had lots of ideas about how I was going to fix the agency that I was working for, which dealt with Medicaid and other types of public benefits. Being a part of the system, I knew it needed to be fixed within it. However, a new supervisor came in about 2 years onto the job, and she decided she was very uncomfortable with the idea that someone with a disability would be advising division heads on how to make policy for people with disabilities. I was ultimately forced out of my position. I was told that I needed to transfer to a different agency. One HR worker suggested that I transfer to Indiana Disability Rights. He looked me up and down and said, "They work with people with disabilities. That would be good for you, right?" I mean, do you know what I'm trying to say here? Unfortunately, I knew all too well what he was trying to say. He was forcing me into that place for other folks, non-powerful folks, folks who didn't have a say in the way that things should be run. Interestingly, one of my first projects at Indiana Disability Rights was to look at societal expectations for youth with disabilities. I knew, being a person with a physical disability, that I would need to go to college and have a white-collar job. But people with other disabilities, intellectual disabilities, mental health disabilities, just to name a few, should have a lot more options. After all, they can work anywhere from a fancy office building to out in the dirt doing landscaping work. Unfortunately, society often expects that these disabled students will not go to work. And for that reason, these students are very rarely given any opportunities whatsoever other than a day program or a sheltered workshop. Our low expectations are even enshrined in law. The U.S. Fair Labor Standards Act, which sets minimum wage, has an exception permitting certain employers to apply for certificates to pay people with disabilities working for them less than minimum wage. In Indiana, we have about 4,000 workers with disabilities making minimum wage, below minimum wage rather, sometimes earning just 1 penny per hour. They often work in segregation, and my calling them workers is very deliberate because they're often deprived of benefits typically given to employees, like workers' compensation, paid time off, retirement benefits. Some people think that sheltered work is okay. They think these are special places for special people. Unfortunately, they deprive people of options. And when we have low expectations, when going to the sheltered workshop becomes the expectation, becomes the status quo, then those low expectations become destiny for people with disabilities. I believe that we really don't need to talk about people with disabilities and their able-bodied counterparts as one being normal or one being other. I believe that essentially we are all interdependent on one another. I believe that is the way a community operates. For example, I need help microwaving my lunch at work, but in exchange, I can edit one of my colleagues' legal briefs. And yes, it's true that people with disabilities do have inherent moral value and dignity, but it's also true that people with disabilities have talents that can equal real economic profit and benefits for their employers. In fact, I would encourage employers now not to avoid people with disabilities, but rather to go out and actively begin recruiting them. In one study done in 2018 by our friends at the Association of People with Disabilities and the Disability In Project, the survey looked at over 100 companies who had made a commitment and prioritized hiring people with disabilities. So of those 100 or so companies, what they found was that people with disabilities brought 28% higher revenue to the companies surveyed. They brought 200% higher net income to those companies. And prioritizing disabilities employment led to 30% higher profit margins for those companies. Those numbers are huge. So what is it that people with disabilities bring to the table? I'd like to highlight just 3 things. First, people with disabilities can substantially affect and improve productivity. Sephora, the cosmetics company, recently committed to hiring more workers with disabilities at its distribution center in Olive Branch, Mississippi. It found that the employees with disabilities had voluntary absentee rates and voluntary turnover rates less than 1/4 that of able-bodied employees. Moreover, the employees with disabilities all met or exceeded the company's productivity standards. Second, people with disabilities can bring their employers a competitive edge. People with disabilities, like other minorities, often view the world as different from the mainstream. They've been spending their lives innovating and experimenting and problem solving to get things done. When we apply these talents to the business sector, more profit and even cost savings can be employed. Third, people with disabilities can benefit their employer's reputation. As we live in a more global economy, we're seeing that customers are increasingly demanding employees that look like them. Well, the world has a disability population rate of about 20%. So not having people with disabilities as a significant portion of a company's employees really makes a difference and is notable. So really, it all comes down to matching the right person, whether they have a disability or not, with the right job. Doing so benefits everyone. The employer increases profits, lowers costs, and the employee gets to earn a salary and become closer to self-sufficiency. Personally, I no longer see my job at Indiana Disability Rights as a chore, but rather an exciting challenge. Would I have chosen the job for myself 20 years ago? Absolutely not. But I've learned to keep my eyes open to unexpected opportunities, and I'd like employers to do the same. Thank you.